everyone. Welcome to the Trail Talk High Pointing Podcast. I'm your host, Lauren, and the guest that we're speaking with today is Chris Hazard from California. Now, YouTubers might know him as Hiking Guy. You can also visit his website at hikingguy.com. Chris covers hiking content from safety tips to outdoor gear reviews to hiking guides and high points. He's a wealth of knowledge when it comes to all things hiking. So, Chris, thank you for everything that you do for the hiking community, and welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Lauren. I'm excited to talk high points.
Yeah. So I'll ask you the same question I ask every guest. What got you started in the outdoors?
You know, I wasn't an outdoors person when I was a little kid. I used to play outside, obviously, but my family didn't go to national parks or anything. It wasn't until I was older, I was reading some books by a guy named Tom Brown, which are kind of like outdoor adventure books. And through that, I took an outdoors course with him, which was kind of like a primitive skills course. And I realized, number one, that I loved being in the outdoors and being in nature. And number two, that I didn't really have to, that I could survive in the outdoors without having to really need money. And it just sort of liberated not only my life, because then it wasn't all about money necessarily. And it was also just another way to get outside. And then I worked for years and I spent a lot of time in front of the computer, and I really just used the outdoors like on the weekends and after work to rebalance myself, just to detox from the screens and everything, because, you know, you don't really think about it, but screens are everywhere, especially today. It's, you know, your television, your computer, your phone, your car. It's hard to get away from screens, and being outside just made me feel so much better.
Wow. I think that's so relatable, especially going to work and being in front of a screen and then using the outdoors to balance that. So where in California did you grow up?
I'm actually from New York, from the New York area. So
okay.
I was born just outside of New York in Jersey City. I spent a lot of my childhood on the Delaware River on the border of New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Actually, I spent a lot of time in the river, like rafting and tubing and doing that. So there was some exposure there. But I live in California. I've lived here for the last 12 years. So and this was a real eye-opener moving out here. I moved out here for work originally. And by the time I moved out here, I was hiking a lot on the East Coast. And I came out here and I moved to a place where it was my wife's job was here. That's why we moved here. And I realized I'm now within, you know, an hour of the mountains, the coastal ranges, the Sonoran Desert, the Mojave Desert. I'm 2 hours or maybe 3 hours away from the Sierras. And it was just eye-opening for me. It was like being in a playground, and it was, you know, it still is. It's hard to decide where to go hike. I mean, sometimes it's dictated obviously by the weather and the conditions, but just having this diversity of choices makes it so much more fun for me.
You're absolutely right. And on a recent trip I had to Southern California in May, I was climbing Mount Baldy, which I'll get into later because I used one of your videos as a guide for that.
Nice.
I was on my way to the ski hut, and there were some people coming down. It was probably like 10 in the morning. And the people coming down, they were, you know, in their 60s, very healthy looking, very like friendly. And they were in this big group, and they were like, "Hey, how's it going? Where are you hiking to? Oh my gosh." I'm like, wow, these people are so happy. And then as I was, you know, continuing on my hike, I'm like, you know, of course they're happy. It's a Tuesday at 10 and they're on a mountain, and they're going to get down, and I don't know, they might go to the beach afterwards. It's just like exactly what you said. It's a playground. There are so many options there.
Yeah, I remember when we first moved here, we're in Southern California, but it's just a different lifestyle from the East Coast. You know, you're obviously outside more because the weather is so nice. And there are a lot of, like you mentioned, a lot of older people who are outside all the time, and they're super healthy and super fit. I remember hiking in a local park called Crystal Cove. My wife was like, "This is like that movie Cocoon, where everyone, you know, where all the old people like get the powers of young people." It was amazing. So it's a nice place to be, and hopefully, you know, retire here and just enjoy it some more.
Oh, that's great. Well, let's get into some of your content. Now, when did you start to turn towards content creation and making hiking videos?
Yeah, well, when I moved out to California, I was doing all these hikes, and I had friends and coworkers coming out, and they would ask me, "Oh, how do you hike Mount Baldy?" and I would share those directions, and I just made them very easy to understand. I mean, up until this point, there wasn't a whole lot of stuff on the internet, and there were, a lot of guidebooks, but it's always a matter of decoding paragraphs of text to really just know whether to go left or right. And I thought, let me just make this simple for people, put a big arrow at the junctions, let them know what to expect. And then I decided to put that on the internet because I figured other people would benefit from it. And I remember a few weeks, and it wasn't a business. I still had a job and a job, I guess. And after a few weeks or maybe a couple months looking at the analytics for the website and seeing that thousands of people were using these guides, and that was when it just clicked that like, oh, wow, this can really help people. This is really useful. And then I just started doing more and more guides. Eventually I started doing guides in person. So I got like my Knowles Wilderness Medicine certification and, essentially gave people guided tours of the trails here. And then COVID happens, and then I stopped doing that. And after that, I got out of my job, and I just been trying to start this full time. I do have part-time jobs once in a while, but I'm just trying to do the guides up there because I realized that by putting them online, I can reach the most people. So the time I would spend prepping for a hike for a group of maybe 5 people that I would take out, I could shoot a video that might help thousands of people understand a trail better. So I've just been focusing on doing this online now, but that's been the journey. I've started it about 10 years ago this year, so it's been a while.
Yeah, and your YouTube channel has over 100,000 subscribers, and it's very thorough content. I mean, you take hikers through everything from the logistics of getting a permit if you need one, or submitting, a lottery entry, to where to park, what to bring, what gear to use. And I think it's important to mention that also you're not sponsored by any companies. So you genuinely want people to use the gear that's going to make them the most successful on a hike. And you're right about the arrows. I love the arrows on the feature as a feature on your videos, because you tell people exactly where to turn, exactly where to go. And like I said, I've used your videos on plenty of hikes, and I recommend them for all the high pointers. And high pointers are also hikers too. We love a good trail. It doesn't have to lead to a state high point necessarily, but I recommend your content to all the listeners and all the viewers. It's very thorough. So now, what led you to high pointing?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because when you hike, you're always kind of high pointing anyway.
Yeah.
Every summit has the summit sign, and it just it's the reward for a lot of different hikes that you just do normally. And there's programs like the guy's name is Jeff Hester. He does a 6-pack of peaks here in Southern California. I think it was expanded, but it's it's a checklist. It's a nice way to feel a sense of accomplishment and push forward, and essentially shoot for a goal and strive for things. And one of the challenges I have on my website and my channel is that because I'm in California, most of my content is from California. Now, California, obviously, there's Yosemite, there's Joshua Tree, there's all kinds of hikes here. But I wanted to reach more people, and I wanted to do something that was fun for me too. I didn't want to just go out and do like the 3 best hikes here, the 3 best hikes there in a templated way. I wanted to do something that was a little more fun. And I realized when I was looking at the high points in the 50 states that a lot of them require, not a lot, but a good amount of them require mountaineering skills. And those wouldn't be hikes or experiences that I would recommend to somebody as a hiking guide. One of the things that you mentioned, that it's very thorough. When you create guides like this, or when I create guides like this, I feel a certain sense of responsibility to make sure that people have the safest experience possible. And the arrows and the comprehensive lists and not being sponsored, that's all part of that. I wouldn't want to recommend a piece of gear that your life might depend on, and it's something I'm getting paid to talk about, and it's really not the best tool for the job. So that's my reasoning behind this whole thing in terms of getting people out there safely, because you can't gatekeep the information. People will find the information no matter what. So let them find good quality information. And when it came to the high pointers, I looked at things like Denali. And it's crazy because if you look on all trails, Denali is listed on there. And I'm sure that some people didn't read didn't click on the little more button on all trails and didn't realize it was a mountaineering and probably showed up somewhere there thinking they could hike it.
You have to fly to the base.
Yeah, I know. But so I thought, what are the points that I can actually hike on a trail, like a maintained trail that don't require any mountaineering or scrambling or things that would move people out of the comfort zone of a normal hike. And that was, that combined with the fact that I wanted to do this and reach more people around the country, I was like, oh, this will be fun. This is perfect because I can do some research and I can get to travel and experience all these. And it might be helpful for me to share this because other people might have the same thing. I'm sure there's a lot of people in the high pointing community that aren't going to do Denali. So maybe there's an alternative.
You're right. And that's one of my favorite parts about high pointing is the accessibility of it. No matter what your fitness level or your physical ability is, there's a high point for you. There's multiple high points for you. I mean, as we mentioned before we started this conversation, it's like you can get out of your car and just walk to some of these high points. And then there are some that are really beautiful scenic walk-ups. And then there are some that require technical skill. And one of your videos lists those those high points that are walkable, and then you separate the ones that require mountaineering skills. So that's another good resource for people who are new to high pointing and they want to see how far they can go before they need to acquire skills, hire a guide, things like that, buy some technical gear, So you bring up a good point about being concerned with your platform and your visibility. There is a responsibility to promote responsible hiking. And you had a video recently about Half Dome, and it covered the tragic event that happened a couple weeks ago where a girl was hiking Half Dome with her father. It was like a summer hike. She was home for college and she slipped and fell on the way down and she tragically died. And you brought up how dangerous that hike is just inherently because so many people are walking up this granite portion, this granite peak that is Half Dome, and eventually that granite kind of smooths out and it becomes kind of slippery. And there have been a number of deaths. Again, you point out that your likelihood is it's not that great, to slip and die, but it can happen.
Yep.
But then you also mentioned in that video that there are some hikes that you do and you record, but then you decide not to put on your YouTube channel because it might not be the safest hike for a beginner hiker or even a moderate hiker. Can you talk about the decision that you make to determine that threshold of what's safe for the average hiker and what's not?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, in general, if there's any scrambling or like rock climbing or even more hardcore route finding, I won't recommend it. And the way I think about it is I think if I had a friend who's not a hardcore hiker, maybe somebody who hikes occasionally, if I gave them the directions for this, would I feel confident that they could complete this safely? And that's kind of the guidepost there in terms of what I recommend. And if you look at a hiking map, look at an OpenStreetMap, which is a standard map that a lot of other maps like All Trails and Garmin, they're all based on OpenStreetMaps. There isn't in a lot of places, a clear designation between what's an unofficial trail and what's an official trail. So, for instance, there's a hike, Bighorn Mine in Angeles National Forest here. The main trail to the mine is a big old mining road, 10 feet wide mining road. And then there's trails going off of it that are, what we call use trails or unofficial trails, but they look like animal tracks. It's hard to follow them. They're small. They generally don't, they're not maintained. They don't have switchbacks or anything. They're straight up and down. And if you look at a map, those two trails are right next to each other and they look exactly the same on the map. So when I explore, I'm trying to come up with a new route or something that's interesting, I'll look at factors like that and I'll say, do I really want to be sending people on this unofficial little trail that's straight up and down, that's loose, where they might get hurt? And, that's generally the outside of, whether they're scrambling or not. That's generally the criteria. Like, is this something I can easily recommend to somebody who, if they follow the directions and they prepare, can do this safely? Because overall, like you said, with Half Dome, it's, I don't see hiking as something you do to seek thrills. When I posted that video, there were a lot of people who said, it kind of reminded me of my child. Like, you can't tell me what to do. This is about the thrills. If you don't like it, don't do it. And that's all fine. But if you market it as a hike, like a regular hike, people are expecting it to have a certain safety level, right? Even if you follow all of the instructions. So that's why I made that video, because I wanted to really just say, this is listed as a hike, but be careful, because it's not really a hike. There's 0.2 miles where your chances of getting into trouble are much higher than the rest of the trail. So things like that go into the calculus there. But overall, this is about having people go outside and be safe. I don't want to recommend something where people are getting into trouble. It's not what it's about.
And another thing I like about your content is that it is generally free of sensation. And that's difficult to find in a lot of outdoor content, outdoor-based content, because a lot of it is like, look at me, look at where I am. And like, the thumbnail on YouTube is like, will I make it? And stuff like that. And it's hard to find somebody that seriously just wants you to take a level of responsible risk and enjoy yourself on the trail and give good resources. And I think that's what your content offers. And it's hard to find those videos that are free of the over sensation in the outdoors. Yeah. I think we're all a little over it by now.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that's another reason why I do it. I mean, I want to make it about the trail and your experience and not about me. Mm-hmm. And it's a different type of video. There's really two types of video on YouTube. There's ones where you're watching almost like a show. You're following somebody's narrative, and they're how dangerous is this going to be? Mm-hmm. And there's ones that are mine, which is more like, I want you to do this. It's more of a how-to versus watching a show or something. So I appreciate that you said that, because that's what my focus is. I want you to go safe. I don't look at hiking as something that should be dangerous. Obviously, there are dangers, just like there are dangers driving to the trailhead. But if you prepare and you know what you're doing, you can mitigate a lot of those and just have it be a pretty, benign experience where you get to enjoy the outdoors.
So when did you get into outdoor gear, and when did you decide to start incorporating gear reviews into your content?
Yeah, so I've always been a tech person. I work in technology, and I've always, been into gadgets and everything. And when I started putting the website up, people would ask me about what I was using to navigate or what I had in my pack. And I started just sharing that. And like a hike, I realized that there weren't a lot of good resources out there that just give you a no-nonsense guide to using a piece of gear like a GPS unit. And I started doing that. And what I've learned over the years is that gear videos, which is why I see a lot of gear videos do much better than trail guides on YouTube or anywhere, because all of these platforms are built around monetization, selling things. Mm-hmm. So if you can talk about things that they want to sell or, sell advertising to, the videos will do much better than just talking about, dirt and trails and trees. So I try to balance it out and just keep it to what I would recommend. I don't talk about really a lot of gear that I wouldn't recommend unless I think people might get it and regret it. But yeah, that's how I got into gear. And if it were up to me, I'd probably just talk about trails all the time, because that's what I love the most. But I realize the gear helps people as well, so I try to include that and do that too.
Yeah, I've had one guest on the show who talked about having to use the SOS button on her Garmin in Utah. She wasn't doing Kings Peak, but she was doing another backpacking trip out there where she had to press that button, and the conditions were so poor that the search and rescue was going to send out a mounted team on horses, and then the horses couldn't make it through, and then the helicopter had to come in and all this stuff. And that button is so important. Have you ever had to use it?
I've used it for other people, which was a benefit that I didn't ever think about for like a Garmin InReach and satellite communicator. That I'm
Hmm.
glad you brought that up because when I was talking about gear, a lot of it's based about on safety,
Hmm.
about what's the gear that people can use to stay safe, and these two-way satellite communicators, even the one-way ones, are game changers. And yes, they cost money, and there's sometimes a subscription, but it can save your life. I can just imagine laying in a ditch and thinking like, oh, I wish I paid $20 a month to have the plan and I could get out of here now. But the added benefit has been being able to trigger that for other people that I encountered on the trail that were not, that did not have it or were not prepared, and get
Wow.
them help. So for me, it's just like a no brainer. It's just part of the equation in terms of costs when you go out there. It's probably the biggest cost, maybe outside of travel, that I have in hiking, is paying for the satellite communicator. But it's important. It's important, and I think it's going to change in the next year or two. There's going to be a lot more satellite-enabled cell phones, so people can call for help, and that's going to
Hmm.
change the landscape of what search and rescue and 911 look like. It's all going to change because I don't think it's ready for the levels of volume that are probably going to come. But it's good. It means that people are safe, and it means that people can go out there with another level of confidence.
Yeah. And if you ever want to see how many people push that button, I follow a lot of search and rescue teams on social media, and they
Mm,
will often put, they'll spare the public some of the more private details, but they will announce some of the searches and rescues that they've had to do, and it's always somebody that was able to call.
yeah,
Well, not
there.
always,
It's
but sometimes.
a lot of times. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
a game changer, and it's obviously it doesn't replace being prepared and
Right.
making good decisions. There's invariably people who comment and say this is going to mean that people are going to call when they have a stomach ache and stuff. I don't think the majority of people do that. It's just like 911. I'm sure there's people who call 911 for frivolous reasons. I know there are. I've heard from people who work in that field, but overall, these things are a game changer. And
Hmm.
yeah, follow your local search and rescue. A lot of people might not know either that most search and rescue teams or pretty much all of them are all volunteers,
Yep.
and a lot of them pay for all of their own gear. So support your local search and rescue team. And it's really, when I think of unsung heroes, because they're not official, they're not usually official like law enforcement or anything, but
Hmm.
these are people who will drop everything to go out and search for someone in hazardous conditions, and risk their own life to save other lives, and they don't really get a lot of recognition. So
You're right.
support them if you can.
You're right. Just out of curiosity, what were the trails that you had to call for help for other people?
Mount Whitney, Mount
Okay.
Whitney,
Hmm.
and one time on White Mountain Peak, which is pretty close to there. It's another
Yeah.
14er,
Yep.
but both altitude related. That's the number one thing I see. I mean, that I see personally on the trail is people pushing through altitude sickness and then just getting so sick that they can't even move, and they have to get somebody to like carry them out.
Yeah.
And the thing I see most just watching the news is heat related, especially this year. It seems like there's been a ton of heat related
Yeah.
deaths. I think people think it's not going to happen to them, and it does. So,
You're right. Speaking of Mount Whitney, and I know we mentioned All Trails earlier, which is a great resource if you
hmm
know the context within which you're using it.
yeah,
My husband and I did the Mountaineers route a couple years ago, and we ran into some hikers. We were guided by Sierra Mountaineering International, and we
mm
ran into some hikers that were using an All Trails map to go up the Mountaineers route, and they were ill prepared, technically speaking, and gear wise for that route. Um, but they got like stuck. They were just too exhausted to come back down, so they spent the night in the hut on the summit, and then
wow,
we're just kind of crawling on their butts down.
wow,
And our guide was just like, "Hey, just like follow us." But they did get a little lost using that All Trails for the Mountaineers route. It's just, again, you have to know. Yeah, All Trails is a great resource, but you have to understand what you're getting yourself into before you take
yeah,
on a route like the Mountaineers route. You have to understand that it's not like class one. It's not a walk up. It's not the standard trail that people do from the portal, for example.
Yeah. I mean, the power of having a GPS on your phone and knowing whether you're on the trail or not is incredible. I mean,
Yeah.
if you ask somebody from 100 years ago or 200 years ago if they could have that power, their minds would be blown. But it doesn't give you any context outside of that blue line.
Right.
So that's the downfall. And a lot of people don't read, don't click on, like I said, like that little more button and read what it really is and read
Yeah.
what it does.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's crazy. You might have seen, it was maybe a month or two ago, but like now Mount Everest is on all trails.
I saw that. Yeah, I did.
It's crazy, right? One of the things that All Trails is doing that I commend them for is they're letting land managers manage the trails. So if you work for a park service, you can go on there and list whether something's closed or not. You can update the route so that it doesn't go on unofficial parts, and that's awesome. But I do wish that there was some kind of classification in All Trails that told you whether this is at least on like a class 1 trail, or this involves scrambling, or this involves something more. That's the one piece of metadata that I think is missing there that would make it a lot more helpful for people.
Sure. And also reading the comments about a trail from the past hikers. It's subjective in that you don't know how experienced they are. They might mention, I'm this experience, or you can look at their All Trails history or something, but it's all very qualitative, and it's all based on kind of their own opinion. And so it's really good information. I appreciate it. When I went to Southern California in May, I was checking that every day to see what the snowpack was like from previous hikers, and that was super helpful. But again, it's subjective.
Yeah. That's what I use. I use All Trails all the time for the trail conditions. I mean, for trip reports, there's nothing that even comes close to it. I know people have tried to do that, but nothing comes close. And I don't think anyone's interested in, reporting on things other places. Obviously, niche communities, like there's a website called Whitney Zone where people leave trip reports, but All Trails across the board, the best resource. But I never use All Trails necessarily to navigate. I'll always just look at that for the, trip reports, and then I'll go and find other resources to get maybe a GPX file or understand a little bit more about what I need to do for that hike.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. And so speaking of my most recent trip to Southern California, I did use your videos on the hikes that I did there.
Thank you.
It was super helpful as far as like where to park, what time to get to the trailhead, how much water I'm going to need. Even though I did it in a different season, it was still very relevant, especially, you're from that area, those hikes. I was coming from North Carolina, basically sea level. And I have to say, when I did Mount Baldy was my first hike that I did when I got out there. And I was just racing up to the ski hut. I was passing so many people, and I'm looking at the average time on All Trails, like calculating, how much I'm going to beat it. I'm like, wow, these people are so slow. Look at me. I get to the ski hut. I sit down, have a couple snacks, and then I start hiking again after the ski hut. And that's when I'm like, oh, okay, now this turns into a real hike.
Yeah.
It got so real after that.
Yeah. That's one that people get into trouble on a lot because of that. Because once you pass that ski hut and you start to pass the tree line, there's a lot more snow. The air is thinner. It's just a whole different experience.
Yeah. Oh, I definitely went way too fast. And the snow, this was early May. I was post-holing everywhere. I brought snowshoes, but I don't know. I was just kind of sliding everywhere in them. The snow just wasn't good for anything.
No. Yeah.
At that time. The Devil's Backbone with the snow, I have to say, was like way less intimidating because it just kind of made it wider.
Yeah. As long as you step in the right place.
Yes. Yeah. Well, there are a lot of footprints, so that was good. But I mean, even using a GPS in the snow, because there were some places where I couldn't find any footprints. People were just kind of doing their own thing. The trails were just everywhere. Having that GPS was really helpful. Yeah,
no, I agree. And that's one of the things I recommend all the time for people is having some kind of electronic. Obviously, you need maps as a backup, but especially in a condition like that where it's snow or maybe you're leaving before sunrise and it's dark out, just having that GPX file is incredible in terms of peace of mind. There's a hike called Cactus to Clouds that goes from Palm Springs. There's a trail that goes up to the tram station called the Skyline Trail. And it's a pretty well worn trail at this point, but still, I've done it many times. But still, when I do it at night, there are times that I might take the wrong turn, or maybe I'm just not paying attention at the right level that I need to. And just being able to, I have like my Garmin, Epix watch, just being able to look down and see whether I'm on that line or not is great in terms of keeping me safe, and an easy way that I can just check in periodically and look like, okay, I'm in the right place. But yeah, when it's snowy out, I always recommend, if people aren't experienced, don't go out in the mountains in the snow. Go on like a Forest Service road or something that's wide and easy to follow, and learn your stuff before you head out into the mountains.
Now, you mentioned Cactus to Clouds. I ran into some people who were doing the Cactus to Clouds. And for the listeners who don't know, the Cactus to Clouds hike is in the San Jacinto Mountain State Park in California. And you start in Palm Springs, so basically like the low desert. Is it sea level?
I think it's a few hundred feet, but it's a Sonoran desert. It's like the desert you'd see on like a Wile E. Coyote cartoon.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you summit Mount San Jacinto, which is 10,000 feet and some change. I can't remember the exact number. And it is deemed as one of the more difficult hikes in California because of the elevation change in such a short amount of time. And I ran into some of the people that were doing Cactus Clouds on my hike in San Jacinto. Now, I did the tramway. So I took the tram up to, 7,000 or 8,000 feet. And then
8,000. Yeah.
Okay. And then I took the trail up to the summit, and I had dinner at the restaurant actually on my way down before I went back to the parking lot. But yeah, the Cactus to Clouds guys, they said that they started around midnight or 2 a.m. or something like that. Is that one of the more difficult hikes you've done?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've done a lot of difficult hikes, and I think Backpacker Magazine did the top 5 most difficult hikes. That was in the list. That's how it sort of got fame years ago. But overall, I think that's the toughest one, just because you have the logistics of planning it out right. And if you're not familiar with it, where it starts in Palm Springs, the temperatures can go up to like 120, I think, or whatever, high, low hundreds. And people have died on that trail because they got stuck there when it's hot. So it's, you're climbing 8,000 feet or so in the first, whatever it is, 8 miles. I mean, it's a very steep hike, and there's not really a lot of room for error. You just have to go up no matter what most of the time, based on the weather. So I think overall that's probably the hardest one, but it's tough. It's relative. I've done hikes that are not as long, and it's been 90 degrees out, and those have been killer. Those have been so hard because of just the heat, and it saps you. Whitney can be tough with the altitude. There's a lot of factors, but probably just on paper, I'd say if you look at a day hike, it's 20 miles and change altogether. It's probably the toughest, if not one of the toughest.
For sure. Now, let's get back to high pointing. What are some of your most memorable high points?
Well, so I'm starting from scratch now. So I think I've done more high points. I know I've done more high points, but I'm starting this challenge from scratch. So I've only got I've got Wheeler Peak in North Carolina. Mount Mitchell, North Carolina. That was my first one that I did.
That was your first one. I didn't know that. That's cool.
Yep, that was my first one.
That's a great hike.
That was fun. Yeah, beautiful. I had done that years ago when I used to live on the East Coast. I used to drive down to the mountains all the time and spend weekends. I'd drive all night to get there, and I'd stay in Gatlinburg or wherever in Asheville and hike.
Yeah.
And the second one I did was actually an alternate. So if you're not familiar with what I've got going, I've basically come up with hikeable alternate peaks for the high pointers that require maybe technical skills. And my first one was Nevada. I did Wheeler Peak instead of Boundary Peak. Now, I know Boundary Peak is doable. Some people, and it gets to your point about all trails, like, some people are like, oh, this is easy, this is hard. It's all in context of the person. So for me to probably go do Boundary Peak, it probably would not be a big deal for me, given my experience. But would that be a hike that I would recommend to somebody else to do? as an alternate high point. And the more I dug into it, I said, no, probably not, especially given that Wheeler Peak, which is only, I think a couple dozen feet lower than Boundary Peak, is serviced by a maintained trail in a national park. So that was a
Oh, that's in
no-brainer.
Death Valley, right?
It's in Great Basin National Park.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And, there's a trail that goes right up there. It's a marked trail. It's maintained by the Park Service. So the fact that it's just a little bit lower and there's a Class 1 trail to the top that's maintained by the Park Service, that became my alternate high pointer for Nevada.
That's cool.
And that's what I went through all the states to figure that out. And it was tough because that judgment call, especially not knowing a lot of these trails personally, is a tough one. So I'd look at YouTube videos, I would do research. Where I ultimately landed in terms of my criteria for the alternates was no mountaineering or scrambling. It had to be a Class 1 trail, had to be on public lands, or easily accessible on private land, like open all the time, not just 1 or 2 days a year. And ideally, it's on a maintained trail. So if it's just a use trail, like the one that I'm struggling with a little bit now, and I mostly have it done. You can look if you're out there and you want to check it out. It's just hikingguide.com/50 list. And I have a spreadsheet. You can check it out. And if you have any feedback, please let me know.
I'll put that in the show notes also.
Cool. But like Kings Peak in Utah. So Kings Peak has a trail. I've seen the videos. It looks like just kind of like a scramble up some talus. It doesn't look too bad, but I don't think that's an official trail up to Kings Peak. So do I say Kings Peak or do I pick an alternate? Some of them like that are tough, like Idaho, some of the states that have higher points, even Washington, a bunch of people told me that South Sister is hikeable pretty easily when the conditions are good, like late summer, no snow, you can just hike up there as a straight hike. So that's been tough, that gray area on some of those states. Whereas, obviously you can Kings Peak is a good example. That's the highest point and you can probably hike up there. I think most people probably could just do that trail based on the YouTube videos I saw. But would it be something that I would recommend to somebody who's maybe a beginner?
Right.
So that's a tough one, especially like I haven't been there. And then the other part of that peak list that's been tough has been some of the lower peaks, like Ohio. I didn't realize Ohio would be so hard because the high point, it's in a parking lot.
Yeah, it is.
So, that's the other criteria. No drive ups. There has to be like at least a little bit of walking. You can't,
Yeah.
you can't go to McDonald's and take your McFlurry to the high point. So Ohio was a tough one because the other high points are on private land. So I did some searches. I did like searches on the OpenStreet map database using ChatGPT and this program called Overpass Turbo to try to find like hikeable high points. And I think I found one, but again, I really just need to go there and check it out. So if you're out there and you have any insight on this, please, leave me comments here. But it's been challenging. But so far, both Wheeler and Mitchell have been incredible hikes. So
yeah, that's awesome. And Mount Mitchell, you can drive up that too if you're not an experienced hiker. There's a lot of different alternatives, and if you can't hike Mount Mitchell, there are plenty of other mountains in Western Carolina that are very hikeable. Grandfather Mountain is one. There's a little ladder part that can be a little kind of scary, but so many great hikes in the area. And that's the great thing about high pointing is it brings you to these places that you never would have gone before. And you learn about other places. Like when I went to climb Mount Rainier, that was my first time in Washington State. It was my first time in Mount Rainier National Park. It made me want to go back and see the rest of the park. Of course, climbing the mountain is a wonderful way to experience the mountain. And I am fortunate to have done that. But I'd love to do the Wonderland Trail. I would love to see some of the waterfalls in Mount Rainier National Park. And I know that some people that I saw on the way up, they would go up to Camp Muir at 10,000 feet and just glissade down, and that was their day hike, and they're perfectly happy doing that. So there's always alternatives, and yeah, I think high pointing has made me realize like there's so much to do in this country. Yeah, you can go see the national parks, you can go to the high points, but on the way to those things, I think you're just introduced to so many other places in the country that have already been explored, but you want to explore.
Yeah. My biggest problem that I have with everything I do is that there's not enough hours in the day.
Oh my gosh.
I wish I could just, and I don't mean necessarily, like taking care of my child or just
Yeah,
a
yeah,
normal,
yeah.
taking out the trash. I mean, like when I went to Great Basin National Park to do Wheeler, I did Wheeler, I did another hike, but man, did I want to just go explore that whole park. I could have like lost myself for a couple weeks just hiking around there.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's part of, it's like an extension of high pointing is really, it's about the adventure and the exploring and that sense of accomplishment when you get something or you accomplish something that you want to. And so far for high pointing for me, it's really just made me want to do even more, which is exciting. Keeps you going.
Oh, absolutely. My most recent trip to California, I took a drive to Big Bear Lake. I'd never been there,
Mhm.
and I had some time, and I did a Bertha Peak up there.
Yep.
It was a really nice day hike, and there were some places along that trail where you got to look out and see the lake and the mountains and everything. And I'm like, what a beautiful place that it
Yeah.
wasn't even on my itinerary. I just kind of drove there, and I'm like, this is so cool. I want to come back and do some other hikes in this area and maybe ski or, you know, what else is
Yeah.
out there, you know? And the
I know.
same thing when my husband and I were in Lone Pine climbing Mount Whitney. The day before, we drove up 395 to go to Yosemite. Such a beautiful drive. That has to be one of the most beautiful roads in America.
Yeah.
And
You have Mono Lake, right? That
oh
whole,
gosh, yeah,
yeah.
yeah, it was incredible. What high points are you most looking forward to?
I'm looking forward to the higher alternate peaks in the Northwest, I guess. So, what's the alternate? Like I said, for Kings Peak, I'm looking forward to Alaska, South Pioneer Peak. That's the one I found that I think is the highest hikeable peak. The ones that aren't so popular, that still might be exciting and fun. I'm
Hmm.
looking forward to those. I'm not really sure what to expect for some of the lower states, especially ones where the hike is really short. I think I'm going to try to find what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to find some other experiences where it's not just maybe a half mile trail. I'll try to loop it in with a bigger trail or make it a little bit more exciting or jazzy, more of an
Yeah,
adventure.
yeah.
But I'm just really excited about going to different places. Like I'm planning on going to South Dakota and North Dakota shortly and doing those. I've never been to either one of those states, and it's just all new and it's
Hmm.
exciting. And I love that feeling of going somewhere that you've never gone before. It's just so much fun. It feels like you're a little kid on an adventure. Just getting off in that airport that you've never been to and renting a car and getting on the back roads and looking at the different scenery and just wondering, oh wow, I wonder what's, like you mentioned earlier, like what's over here, like what great hikes are here. And
Hmm.
that just excites me so much. And with the 50 list, there's so much to do. And even outside of that, there's like the high points in the parks, and there's just not enough hours in the day, like I said, just to do it all. So
No, and there's also county high pointers too.
yep,
Yeah. Of
yeah,
course, California would take you a long time.
yeah, a lot of peaks here.
So yeah, that's one thing I've learned doing this podcast is how many lists there are out there. I had never met a county high pointer until I did this podcast. I didn't know that national park high pointing was a thing. I've recently learned about borough high pointing in New York City. Um, so
I did not. I'm from New York. I did not even realize that was a thing. So
it it can like if you can think of an area of land, there's going to be the highest point of it, and people are going to
yeah,
make lists. That's one thing that high pointers have in common is we love maps and we love lists, and so um, we're peak baggers. And I know that there's a sentiment when it comes to peak bagging. Well, it's not all about just reaching the summit. And of course it's not. We
Yeah.
all love the journey. And even me, I love the training that I have to do in order to accomplish a goal. Um, especially before I went out to California, there was a lot of working out I did and carrying a heavy load on my back just to make sure that I was okay at altitude. And I love that because it makes me a healthier person. It makes me a better person. And there's nothing wrong with setting a goal and accomplishing it. Of course, if you practice leave no trace and you're a responsible hiker and you reach a summit, even if you don't reach a summit, just I've talked to plenty of people who have visited Denali multiple times just to get to the top. And every time they learn something about themselves, about the mountain, about mountaineering. Like I said, as long as you are responsible about it, I think it's all good.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. You put it in a better way than I was trying to before, but when I was younger, I was a bike racer and everything was very structured. Training plans and periodization and intervals,
Wow.
like everything was super structured. And I don't do that anymore just because I don't like it as much. I don't have the time. But doing high pointing gives you some structure where you can do things like that. You can train and you can build up, and it's not so intense as a professional sport or
Mm-hmm.
an amateur sport. But you still have that structure. You still have those goals. You have that always there, and I think that helps just as a person to get you through challenges in everyday life. Because
You're right.
otherwise, I think you just get buffeted by things and you're just a pinball. And this way,
Yes.
you're always moving towards a goal. You have that point on the compass you're heading to, and the other things work around these challenges and these buildups that you do.
Yeah, it's a character building hobby, and I
Hmm.
very much enjoy those things. And I've talked to a lot of people where I say, what's your favorite part of high pointing? And they'll often talk about how comfortable the world that we live in is. We've made it for ourselves, and that's it. Overall, it's a good thing. We know where our next
Hmm.
meal's coming from, most of
Yeah.
us, and we're fortunate to know that. And we can buy clothes, and we have shelter, and we have a way to get around, and our life is generally convenient in this country.
Hmm.
But I think it is innate that we have this like primitive sense of like we need to struggle in order to feel accomplished. And when our life is so convenient, sometimes we have to manufacture that struggle. That's why do people jump into ice baths every day? Because they want to struggle a little bit first thing when they wake up in order to feel like, oh, I did that. All right, now I can do other stuff. Or
Yeah.
why do people put themselves through so much? Try not, I don't want to swear on this podcast. Um, People go really hard at the gym every
Yeah.
day because of course it's good for your health, but like there's this challenge that every human wants. Why do we pitch a tent and not use an air conditioner at night and cut off all connectivity, in terms of internet? Because we want that simple life that gives us a challenge that we can overcome. Because I really think that it is only human to want that. And
Yep.
I catch myself sometimes like falling into these little convenience traps. Like the other night, I got up from my sleep and I went to the thermostat and I lowered the temperature 1 degree. Like, that's the world we live in. I'm like, I don't want it 72, I want it 71. And that's when like I've become way too comfortable. It's time to get out. It's time to just strip all of the conveniences of life away and just live simply for a night or two. Go on a hike where the conditions are dictated by nature and not me and my thermostat, and
Yep.
just really live. That's where you find that balance, and that's where you really get back to yourself, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, when you look at how long humans have been on Earth, most of the time that humans have been here, we've been living with nature, living in harmony with nature, outdoors. Even in the last several hundred years or several thousand years, people have been farming. People have been not just hunter gatherers, but farmers working with the land. And it's not until really the last 100 years, maybe the last 20 or 30 more, has been more accelerated, that we're just so cut off from the outside world and from nature and from having those types of struggles that, there's just something not human about it. There's something not natural about it. And, like you said, I found that just, struggling and going outside and even just the challenges on a hike, sometimes the conditions might be bad. And I'm not saying push through to dangerous conditions, but you might just be having a hard day and you're like, I can do this. But just having those struggles build your character. And it's hard to explain to somebody who might just be sitting in an office and sitting on a couch. But once you kind of get a taste of that and you know what it can offer, I think you get hooked on it.
Exactly. Well, I want to close out this podcast with the same questions that I ask everyone else. So how has hiking and high pointing enriched your life?
Yeah, it's a lot of, just to encapsulate what we just talked about, it gives me something to look forward to, gives me something to focus on, and it helps me as a YouTube creator and a guide put a lot of the other things that I do into context, right? Because now I'm going to do a high points in South Dakota or something, so I can maybe try different gear that I would normally have in Southern California. I can do all those things, but it's, number one, it's just a nice way to keep moving forward in a healthy way for me. I'm excited to do the States and do things that lie beyond that.
That's great. And finally, what is a podcast, documentary, or outdoor adventure book that you would recommend to other listeners?
The one that stands out to me that really had an effect on me is the Ken Burns National Park documentary.
I love that.
Yeah, it's great. It's long. It's long, and if you like it, it's a good thing that it's long. But just understanding how special the national parks are, what a unique idea that was, and to see how it's evolved. And, today it's just something you take for granted, but it wasn't obviously always like that. And now you see countries all over the world using the model here in the States to do national parks. But that was huge for me. And it's really fun too, because once you watch that and you know who different people are, like Mather, and you go to every national park in the West, there's like some kind of a Mather point or a Mather plaque or Mather this or that. But it makes everything else a little more enjoyable. But I would recommend that to people if you like hiking in the outdoors. That Ken Burns documentary is definitely a great one. And I'd also mention that I as doing these guides, I do a lot of research into the hikes, and I find that going into old guidebooks, like going on Amazon and finding older printed guidebooks for hikes and outdoors area, I learn a lot more, because a lot of times when you look online, there's not a lot of context, there's not a lot of background for hikes and for the outdoors. But a lot of the older books will go into that and some of the history. And if you like to dig deeper and not just go on a walk, but look around and understand what's around you, having a guidebook or going to a channel like what I try to do on mine, where I can offer you more context to what's going on, I think just makes the experience of hiking so much more fun and more interesting.
Yeah, that's great. Well, you can find him on YouTube, Hiking Guy. You can find him on his website, hikingguy.com. Chris, it has been so awesome having you here. I can't believe I met you. I'm just like a total fan of everything that you do. Like I said, your videos are a resource for me. They're a resource for a ton of listeners, and it is so awesome to meet you. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, and I had a blast, and I'm looking forward to doing the high points. Maybe I'll see you out there someday.